director. This is an old bio, and we haven't done the Lyceum lately, but that's something that must be a hint. Okay. Lyceum director hopes to work to develop a lending library, which we have started. We do have some books in our library
Just
now
got a
that have been
donation today.
donated. We got one today from Ecuador. So, to promote the study of spiritualist philosophy. Stephen is also a local historian and is currently working on researching and documenting the history of the spiritualist movement in Rochester. And if you follow him, he has a blog and he posts things on Facebook and everything that's very, very interesting, stories about Rochester spiritualism, which is huge. And Stephen. Oh, and did you do that? Mm-hmm. Thank you. I was gonna, oh well. Yeah,
Okay. Awesome. So, first of all, I want to say this was not planned, but Gigi was like the perfect compliment to this. And I know because really so I'm going to be talking about celebrations that honor the soul, the continuity of the soul in different parts of the world. And I love it because you touched on a lot of the things that I didn't. So it was very complimentary with this. So I'm very happy about that because some of the things I focused a little bit less on, perfect, things fall into place. So one of the things that I kind of want to focus with this and then kind of tie it together is that these things that I'm going to talk about, this is some research I did on different celebrations that honor really honor, I want to say the eternity or continuity of the soul, because none of this is really an ending. And none of these are celebrating endings. They're all celebrating beginnings, or as if the soul is living. And the thing that's just fascinating about all of these things that you'll see is that, as Gigi demonstrated, despite thousands of years differences, thousands of miles differences, two completely different continents, it's the Aztec peoples and Celtic peoples, there was no contact. There was no contact, yet the celebrations are almost identical in meaning. And it's so fascinating about that because the one thing that they all have in common is that they're human celebrations for other humans. And you just see the connections with this. So the first one I'm actually going to start with is the oldest one, which is in ancient Egypt. So we have records of Egyptian records that are on papyrus that were preserved in the sand of Egypt because the environment is perfect for drying things out. Mm-hmm. And so we know about this from inscriptions and things like that. And the first festival that took place in actually early August was called the Wag Festival. And during this holiday, people would leave small boats that they would make in the River Nile as both religious symbolism for the death and resurrection of the god Osiris, and also to honor their deceased loved ones during their journey to the afterlife, which was called Aru, or the Field of Reeds. And it was sort of them symbolically standing in for this deity, Osiris, who died but then became alive again, not just in a kind of symbolic way, but literally just was alive again. So they felt that their ancestors would be alive again, which was why the afterlife was shown as the Field of Reeds, because it was this kind of idealized version of Egypt, the lushness of the Nile, and it was a living place with flowers and birds and all these wonderful things. It wasn't this cavernous darkness or anything like that. It was alive and vibrant, and it was there. And they would celebrate with their ancestors, quite literally. They would go to their tombs and leave them offerings and things like that. So, jumping across the Mediterranean, in ancient Rome, they celebrated the Parentalia. The Parentalia was a 9-day festival held in honor of the deceased ancestors. The festival was actually held in mid-February. The religious calendar in ancient Rome actually began in March with spring, because it's the first month, and it's the new beginnings. And so February was actually the end of the year. So they set aside the end of the year sort of as like a symbolic thing for like, okay, these are the ancestors, they've gone on, this is the end into a new beginning. And it was also a year for time of year for purification, which actually kind of ties into the like spring cleaning type thing. And so the last month of this year, February, would be dedicated to the spirits of the dead and also for purification. During the Parentalia, families would visit the tombs of their ancestors and leave small offerings of cakes and wine. The wealthy would distribute bread, treats, and small gifts to the poor. Maybe foreshadowing of trick-or-treating. And any disagreements were either set aside or reconciled during the holiday. So even if you didn't reconcile it, you were not allowed to argue because you had to be with family. And it's really funny because like some of the Roman,
If only, right?
no, it's funny because some of a few of the Roman poets, particularly Ovid, was like that. He was just like, sure. So yeah, that's still another human thing that kept going. But the festival ended on February 22nd, which was known as the Charista. Families would gather together and exchange gifts, offer incense to the household gods known as the Lares, and they would have like kind of like a family dinner. Like the whole household would come together and have a family dinner. And so the Romans did something very interesting. When we kind of combine our festival for the dead, like in the Western world, All Souls Day, Halloween, which I will get to, and we kind of combine the two where they're sort of like ghosts and then ancestors. In Rome, they completely divided this. So the Parentalia was like a wholesome time to remember one's ancestors and focus on like purification and cleansing and kind of a positive attitude for like the coming spring. The other festival dedicated to the spirits of the dead was known as the Lemuria. The Lemuria was a much more ominous time. It was kind of associated with the restlessness of the spirits of the dead, and the Romans kind of divided them. So it was sort of like your ancestors, then there were ghosts. The festival was actually spread throughout the month of May, and it was on the 9th, the 11th, and the 13th days of the month. During the Lemuria, it was believed that the shades of the restless dead were allowed to leave the underworld and walk freely among the living. During the nights of the Lemuria, the heads of the household would walk through their house at midnight and purify the home of any wandering spirits. They would do a few different things. They would burn juniper, which in ancient like Italy was like sage is kind of used here. And they would scatter black beans, which had ritual connections to the spirits of the underworld, while the rest of the family would actually clang pots and pans to ward away these unwanted spirits. And it's one thing that I find actually really interesting that I found while I was researching this, that taboo of that month was so strong that it's because the month of May for the Romans was so associated with ghosts and the dead, it was actually considered unlucky to hold weddings on this month, and a custom that has passed directly into the modern era. Like, because I don't know if anyone knows about that whole, like, they say, like, don't have a wedding in May, it's bad luck. Because I have heard of that. So, I'll only talk a little bit about this, because Gigi touched on it, thank you. In Northern Europe, particularly those areas populated by the Celtic peoples, Samhain was one of the four main festivals of the Gaelic calendar, marking the end of the harvest and the beginning of winter. It was like it was a liminal time, and it was not only did they think that the spirits of their ancestors could pass through into this world, but they also thought that the fairy world could easily be crossed into this world. And they had this sense of kind of like caution, careful, respectful caution that these spirits could play tricks on them at best, and then at worst, possibly even spiriting them away to like the fairy world. which has all sorts of fascinating, unusual things and fairy tales and stuff, where people go there for like 10 minutes and they come back and like 100 years has passed and things like that. Or on the other positive side, sometimes they come back and they have spiritual gifts, the ability to heal, the ability to see into the other world. Interesting things. So the souls of the dead were thought to revisit their homes seeking hospitalities and offerings, and bonfires were lit. The kind of one of the big symbolic things about that was bonfires, which to welcome in the good spirits and drive away unwanted ones, which sort of has slowly trickled down into the concept of jack-o'-lanterns. And then in the early modern era, like not ancient Celts times, but more like fully Christianized Irish times, people would also go to door in costumes, reciting verses and singing songs in exchange for food or money. And the costumes may have been a way of kind of imitating or disguising oneself from these spirits that kind of wandered about. The other fun thing was that divination and fortune telling was also a very important custom that usually involved nuts and apples. This is sort of kind of survived, but not as much as it used to be in like the 1900s and 20s, where people would like do all sorts of things. And it was mostly young people who wanted to see who they were going to marry, because Halloween, as Samhain eventually came to be, was one of the few times of the year where young people could actually be together, like in a holiday sense. So they would have a lot of kind of like appropriate ways of flirting with each other. Sort of like, oh, this apple looks like your name. And again, all of these customs largely contributed to our modern tradition of Halloween. Actually, that book over there, which is the first prize for probably Dale, you all can look at it, because that really tracks kind of the history from like Celts to the Irish to American traditions of Halloween, because I'm not actually going to focus that much on Halloween. So another festival that was celebrated around the world for honoring ancestors is actually the Chinese Ghost Festival, which has it's interesting because the way that these words are used in sort of like the American translation of Chinese is a lot more positive than we would think, because it says Ghost Festival, and they also use another term that uses the word hell, but it's actually not a bad concept, which is just kind of interesting how that was translated. So the Ghost Festival is held during the 7th month of the Chinese calendar, which is roughly August. It sort of depends on when the moon is. Their calendar is lunar, so it tends to move a bit. So during this month, the gates of the underworld, which again, it's a very faulty English translation, because the Chinese afterlife is very interesting of how it's perceived for spirits. But the gates, or the veil, is thinned, and spirits of the dead are free to roam the earth, where they seek food and entertainment. Family members offer prayers to their deceased relatives. They offer food and drink, and they burn these form of incense called hell banknotes, which are literally money. It is incense in the shape of money, because in the Chinese afterlife, it is basically a mirror of this one, and you want money because you can buy things, apparently. So these are made of joss paper, and joss paper items are believed to have value in the afterlife and are considered to be very similar in some aspects of the material world. This is one of the most fun traditions I've ever come across, and I've known about this for a while. So joss paper is like a form of incense that burns really quickly. And so not only is it money, but you can like go to, especially if you're like in a place where there's a lot of Chinese immigrants in America, and you can buy like these little things, and you can also get them in China, and temples sell them. And they're like, imagine like little incense versions of things that you like. So I have seen iPads, cars, little houses, and you buy them and you like burn them. They're just incense, and you burn them for your ancestors, because it's like they wanted these things, they loved these things, I'm gonna send them this into the afterlife. One of my favorite ones I ever saw, which literally almost bought actually for myself because I was like, this actually would be good for my ancestors. And it was like a mini casino. And it had little cards and a little it was like a little plaque, and it had like little cards, little slot machines and chips. And like a little roulette wheel and stuff like that, and you burn it, and it's supposed to like materialize in the spirit world. Or if you don't necessarily literally believe that, it's still a symbolic way of remembering them, and it's just a fun way of remembering them too. So another thing that families also do, besides for their ancestors that they have this connection with, is families also pay tribute to unknown wandering spirits, so that these souls don't intrude and bring misfortune, because there's a belief in Chinese versions of Buddhism and Taoism that some of these lonely spirits need people to pray for them, which we'll see again and again in a lot of these other traditions, and even in spiritualism. A large feast is held for these spirits, and people will bring food and place them as offerings. So like specifically for like their ancestors, a lot of this is actually outside. It's like big, huge party. They'll have like a picnic kind of, and they'll set aside a spot specifically for them, as Gigi mentioned that they do in Celtic customs and stuff like that. Only this is much louder. This is celebrated with like firecrackers and all sorts of things. And again, it's just a very happy celebration because they're celebrating that their ancestors are with them. They're celebrating with their family as if they weren't gone, because they're not. And then Buddhist and Taoist temples. So in China, Buddhism and Taoism there's a much thinner line between religions in Asia, so you can be like all three things at once and no one will care. So Buddhists and Taoists will hold ceremonies to relieve these kind of suffering spirits, and they'll hold usually ceremonies in the afternoon or night, and they will the priests will kind of offer them food and drink, sort of like, no, you all are welcome, come here, relieve yourselves, and then they'll pray for them while they're there. And the monks or priests will throw rice and other small foods into the air, into like the different directions for all of these spirits, so that none of them are forgotten. Across the Sea of Japan, into Japan, the Ghost Festival was actually brought by Buddhist missionaries to Japan, medieval Japan, and it adjusted itself to local customs because they're very different cultures, but they do have a shared background of Buddhist and Taoist and Confucian spiritual traditions. And the festival became known as Oban. The Festival of Oban is a Japanese holiday that lasts for about 3 days. And the dates vary within Japan. Most places celebrate it in July, but some places celebrate it in August, specifically rural areas, because they actually keep the Chinese folk customs of the old lunar calendar, whereas most of Japan has just switched to like the Gregorian calendar that we use, with like fixed dates for things. And it usually falls around the 15th of one of those months. So the Bon Festival, like the Ghost Festival, incorporates teachings from Buddhism and Confucianism to honor and pray for the spirits of the dead. People will return to their family places. Literally, people will fly home for like these celebrations because it's a big community event, and they'll clean their ancestors' graves, and they'll go to their family altars to pray. One of the customs in Japanese Buddhism, which is influenced by Confucianism, is that they'll have like these huge family altars that have been collected for like hundreds of years, and they have little almost like little tombstones with like their family's name on them, and it's a way to keep them in their house because they may not be able to go all the time to the cemetery. So it's sort of like you have this huge memorial in your own home. And a lot of the time nowadays, people just use pictures. So it's just you have pictures of your loved ones, and there'll be a statue of the Buddha on it, and it's just a way that they can pray to them. But one of the differences is that this festival incorporates a folk dance known as Bon Adori, which is simply just called the Bon Dance. which is not linguistically related to the word for bonfire. I found that out. It comes from it actually comes trickling down from like an Indian version of a Chinese translation of a Buddhist sutra that was dedicated to talking about praying for the spirits of the dead. The music and style of the dance would vary by region, and the dances take place at night during the nights of the festivals. And it's funny because in modern times, these are like, it's almost like if you combine All Souls Day with like the state fair. Like some communities will hold huge has anyone here seen the movie Spirited Away? Yeah, so it's like the big festival where they had like all the food and games and stuff like that. It's just like that. And so they would have like rides and games and food, and then they would also have on the last night, so they would have these bonfires, and the dance actually takes place around the fire, and it's actually very upbeat kind of music, and the dances are supposed to be this welcoming gesture, welcoming in their the spirits to come be with them and dance with them. And there's all sorts of like stories in Japanese folklore where like people will, okay, like they'll see extra people dancing, and then when the dance stops, they're gone. And it's sort of like that they saw their ancestors with them. And then on the last night of the festival, they have like a dance where they're danced off, where like they go in like the other direction to kind of like say like, you know, thank you for being here, please come again, but you know, it's your time for us to go home now, like we're gonna part our ways. So going back to Western Europe, with the conversion of Western Europe to Christianity, from various pagan traditions, the Western churches would set aside a time of the year to honor souls of the departed. It wasn't, so the conversion of all of Western Europe to Christianity was more of a slow acculturation rather than just like a forced thing. So what tended to happen was that a lot of holidays would just sort of become Christian holidays. So in the earliest centuries, when kind of like Christianity was this brand new thing, the church actually set aside a festival to honor the souls of the departed that was held in Rome during the month of February. And it was sort of an attempt to be like, you don't have to give up your custom of the parentalia, we're just gonna do it this way. And so they slowly kind of slow burned it out. But what happened was, as the Christian church was spread by missionaries into more northern areas of Europe over like the next couple centuries, a lot of these northern countries, Ireland, the areas of like Gaul, like Spain and stuff like that, that were primarily influenced by the Celts, tended to celebrate their festivals in like November, October. So finally, in the 11th century, the abbot of the famous Abbey of Cluny, which was this, it was like a center of learning in like kind of the Dark Ages. So like, it was this huge cathedral with this abbey where all these monks lived, and it was where there were libraries and stuff like that. So it was kind of the center of like this Western educated group of people. The abbot declared that all of the monasteries that were associated with that particular monastery, and there were like thousands of them, and their associated churches would celebrate a commemoration of all the faithful departed to be observed with alms and prayers for the relief of the suffering souls on November 2nd, per local customs. And this became known as All Souls Day. It was eventually slowly accepted through Northern Europe and then kind of trickled into Southern Europe, Italy, and those places as well. So in Catholicism, which was the dominant religion at the time, it was taught that those who die in God's grace but are still imperfectly purified enter into a state of purgatory, or purification, where they can purify themselves of their minor sins and eventually enter heaven. The Catholic Church teaches that this purification process can actually be assisted by prayers and actions of the faithful on earth. So what they kind of did was, okay, all these customs that you used to do, giving wine and bread to your spirits and stuff like that, we're gonna have these so that if you offer these things and say these prayers, it can help your ancestors become more elevated in the afterlife, which is sort of the spiritualist translation of what they said. And this is in Catholic Europe, this is largely justified because the Catholic Old Testament has a few books that the Protestant Old Testament does not have, and one of the books discusses praying for the souls of the departed. In Protestant Europe, when it switched to non-Catholic Christian churches, it's interesting because these traditions were still kind of kept in like most like of the churches that you hear in Europe, like Lutherans or Anglicans. They still have these like traditions of kind of praying for the departed, even though those churches kind of tried to get rid of them because they said these are too Catholic, these are too not, needless infighting. Culturally, people still are praying for their ancestors, no matter what. And so I listed a few of the traditions that are in Europe because they're very different and regionally specific. So like in the United Kingdom, they have a concept of making soul cakes, which is, again, like those little cakes that they give to the spirits. They're small spice cakes filled with allspice, nutmeg, cinnamon, ginger, and other sweet spices, raisins or currants, and are baked with a small cross on top. And these used to literally be given as, they would be given as alms, which in the church it was thought that if you give charity, it actually can help the spirits of your ancestors. So you don't necessarily have to give them an offering, you give to the poor, and it's supposed to help them in their name. So like when some people, dedicate a charity in honor of someone, it was supposed to help them. But these were also given to the poor who would go souling door to door, which was they would dress up in costumes and ask for soul cakes. And back then, there was also usually a lot of whiskey involved as well. So sometimes they had tricks played on them if they did not give them a soul cake. In Poland, All Souls Day is known as Zaduszki. And families will visit their cemeteries where their ancestors are buried. And I found this fascinating because I did not know about this. And I guess all the Polish travel websites I was looking up talking about this custom said, like, if you are going to visit Poland in the fall, they said, you have to see this. Because all of the cemeteries, they said it's almost like it's daylight outside because all of the different color candles just light everything up, and it's so beautiful because people will be singing hymns, and it's just this very soft, kind of solemn celebration, but there's still kind of a little bit of happiness to it because they're there with their loved ones. Then this one is close to my heart for obvious reasons. In Italy, All Souls of the Dead is known as Giorno dei Morti, which is Day of the Dead. And in most of Italy, they have like a traditional type of biscotti cookie known as ossa di morti, or bones of the dead, and they're shaped like little bones. And they'll leave them out for like both their ancestors and also just to eat. And then the weirdest one, which of course I love this, in Sicily, on the eve of All Souls, so this would be actually November 1st, going into All Souls Day, they believe, culturally, I don't know if people actually believe this, but it's kind of like a Santa Claus type thing. The spirits of the ancestral dead will visit their living loved ones, and in the morning, children will wake up to find a treat or toy left to them from the good souls of the dead. So it's sort of reverse trick-or-treating, where like these spirits bring kids' toys, and it's not as grim as you'd think, because it's sort of like their grandparents came and left them a toy. And it's a time of the year that they can sort of be like that they're not gone. And in the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is sort of like Eastern Europe, Greece, parts of Africa, India, where it's not Western Roman Catholicism, the tradition that is similar to All Souls Day is known as Saturday of Souls, and it's actually held near Easter. It's a bit different how they celebrate it. It's more of it's more of attached to the celebration of Easter, and they kind of tie in together with the story of Jesus of Nazareth dying and then being reborn. And so they sort of tie that symbolism together where their ancestors have died and have been reborn in heaven. Then, what I want to end this with is in the Americas. So as Gigi mentioned, with the ancient Aztec and Nahua and Olmec origins of part of the holiday with the idea of celebrating their ancestors with happiness, that was merged with kind of the more mourning idea of All Souls. Because All Souls Day can be happy, but there's still kind of a sense of somberness to it as it's celebrated in most places in Europe. And so what happened was you have this kind of like macabre European ideas of like remembering kind of like the fleetingness of life, where they have like these skeletons, and it's this very kind of like dark, sad, almost like goth idea of like the afterlife melded with this joyful living. And so what ended up happening is you have these skeletons that are supposed to be sad that are decorated as being completely happy, drinking, and like just celebrating. So it kind of turned All Souls Day on its head. This multi-day holiday involves family and friends gathering together to pay respects and to remember friends and family members who have died. These celebrations can take on a humorous tone as celebrants remember funny events and anecdotes about the departed. Dia de los Muertos is actually a very specific Mexican holiday, because it was those kind of those Native American tribes mixed with the Spanish colonialism that came to have like a mestizo Mexicanness to it. There are other celebrations of Dia de los Muertos in Latin America and the Caribbean, but they're different. They're not quite how it is in Mexico, where it's this huge, happy, big holiday. And it's actually kind of spread into different countries, the idea of Dia de los Muertos. So it's gone into, from like the south, like Guatemala and Honduras, they celebrate it more in this happier way now, to also into the Southwest, like United States, to anyone who's lived in like Southern California, Texas, or stuff like that. It's become like it's not limited to Mexican American communities. It's actually gone outside of that into other communities as well. I actually grew up in Southern California, and in my middle school and my younger siblings' elementary school, they made it part of the community. They would have school projects where all the kids would make little ofrendas and of their little altars to people who had passed on out of shoeboxes, and they would line them up outside, and they would have like these little electric candles, and at night everyone could go and they would have food and stuff for the families, and it was this big family thing where they would have like little candles that the youngest family members made in honor of the oldest family members that passed away. And it's been this big thing. And so some traditions connected to the holiday is marigold flowers, which bloom around that time and are beautiful, building the little home altars called ofrendas, and they have favorite foods and beverages, and also visiting the graves of the deceased. And this was a huge thing because they would actually be like full-blown picnics just in the cemetery, music playing. They would have like mariachi bands, piñatas, and it was this big happy celebration because they were saying like, they're not gone, you're here, you're with us, and we remember you. And even people who may not have believed in the literal continuation of the soul believed in the continuation of their memory, and they would always have that with them. So one other thing is that November 1st is actually dedicated as part of Day of the Dead to the souls of children who passed away. And they're called Los Angelitos, the little angels, and people would get all, so it was specifically for kids, and so they would have toys on the altars and all sorts of things like that, and they would kind of simultaneously remember the children that are here and also the children that didn't make it. Whereas the second day is more for everyone, where they would dedicate like bottles of tequila, mezcal, cervezas for their family members that are still here and there. And they would bring trinkets and candies to the altars, and families would also have these pastries. The bakeries would have these amazing pastries that were made with kind of local things, seasonal things at the time. So they would have like this pumpkin-filled, candy pumpkin-filled pastries called like pan de muerto, and sugar skulls, as Dale made us last year. And it was just this wonderful, amazing holiday. And one of the things when I was researching all of these different things that I kind of wanted to do was I was thinking of how does this fit into like the context of spiritualism? And I've seen certain things kind of floating around talking about how spiritualism is kind of different. I've seen a lot of things talking about how the differences of spiritualism with these traditions. And the more I researched this, the more the barriers of these differences just broke down completely. Because one of the things that all of these people's celebrations have in common is it's not just one time of the year. It's just one time of year to remind them that the rest of the year, all of their ancestors are always there and always with them. And spiritualism, one of the principal teachings in spiritualism is that it's not a, like, I guess you could say in some things are like revealed religions where there's like a prophet or something like that. It's a religion that's found based on the idea of just sort of natural phenomenon. And this is natural phenomenon. It is humans expressing their innate belief in this communication with their ancestors, that they're not gone. And we can, at least from the spiritualist perspective, we can show evidence of them not being gone. And so I thought the best way that I could tie it together was to look for something spiritualist to kind of end this with. So I have my little spiritualist manual, and I found this, and I just wanted to read this. There is no death, there is no night. The loved one passed beyond our sight is living in eternal light, removed from care and pain. Someday in a fairer land, we shall hear the voice, we shall touch the hand, and with lifted hearts which understand, we shall see our own again. Thank you.